Once the production is finished and all of the ideas in the track, they have to all be balanced and sound good. This is where mixing comes in. Today I want to give you 15 tips for your mixing, which allows you to improve quickly and get the mixes that you want. The first tip is all about creating a system. Once you start mixing, it might seem a little bit daunting, all of the different things that you can do to the different sounds, but soon you'll find that often you use the same tools to get rid of the same issues in your tracks. You might have a whole bunch of different plugins installed that you want to use, but when you have the proper system in place, that you can get rid of any of the basic issues that you have, then you can start to experiment with some unique plugins, maybe something that you want to test out. The important thing for mixing is that you first detect all of the issues that need to be taken care of, and then you start to become a little bit more experimental. Take for example this mix right here. This is currently at the stage where I've just added all of the elements and I have started to dive into the creative aspect of things a little bit here. There's some techniques that I'm testing out here, some that I'm going to be talking about very soon as well in this video. And one of the major things that I'm testing out here is that I am testing out some bus processing. This is a channel strip plugin that I own, and I just put that on the drum bus. Now this is not necessarily there to exactly shape the sound the way that I like it, because to be honest, I do not know this plugin yet. I've had it in my collection for quite some time, never really used it, so I figured it would be a good time to just start experimenting with it a little bit. This can only be really done because I have a system in place that already takes care of taking out all of the issues in my track. With the way that I add things to it, the way that I initially balance it, this is already pretty close to the final mix that I want it to sound like, and this experimentation can happen in the details. What having a system also does for you is it helps diagnose certain problems that you might recurringly have with your productions. If every time you worked on a track, you get to the mixing stage, you have to EQ out certain frequencies of the kick drum or from the drums, you'll know that that's a problem, and that's something that you can actually take care of in the production stage as well. By maybe designing your kick differently, designing your drums differently, or by preemptively fixing this kind of issue in the production so that you don't have to take care of it in the mixing stage and you can focus on the more interesting parts of mixing. Now everybody is going to have a different workflow when it comes to mixing. So as an example, when it comes to this project here, all of these files are normalized. I'm not keeping any of the level balances of the original production. When I do import them into the project, these files, I do set them to -8 dB so that I get 8 dB of headroom. But that still means that at the beginning of the mixing stage, all of the different tracks are actually normalized between each other and therefore play at the same peak level. Now this is one of my own productions. If I'm working on a client's production, if I'm mixing for somebody else, then I wouldn't really do this. In that case, I would keep the level balances of the original production, and I'll use that initial production mix as kind of like a guide for what I want the mix to actually do. Now there's also a lot of producers that like to mix within the production project itself. I would recommend not doing that. What you can do is freeze all of the tracks in your project. That way you get all of the sounds in audio form, and the reason why that is helpful is not so much because then you have a waveform to look at, but it takes you out of the production mindset. You can no longer go in there and edit MIDIs or edit presets. It is now all about taking this existing idea and really finding all of the spaces that the different parts of that idea need to take up. Now, honestly, for results, it doesn't really matter which style that you go for, if you export and open it up in a new project or if you just freeze it in the old project. What matters is the fact that you no longer are in that production mindset, and therefore you can really move on to the balancing, which is really a different mindset when it comes to mixing. So my tip is do commit all of your sounds basically to audio so that you're in the right mindset before you start your mixing sessions. And speaking about sessions, you may be worried that that takes a lot of time and that you need to sit there for hours listening to your track. And while that is true, you don't really have to do it in one session. In fact, I prefer it to do it personally in multiple sessions. That way, in between sessions, I can export the track and listen to it on phones. That is one basic advantage that you get from that. But another advantage is that you can kind of clear your mind a little bit and you can come back into the project and redecide on the decisions that you've made up until that point. Sometimes for a client's mix, that is not really possible because they're on a tight deadline, but I try to do it as much as I can because I do think that it helps improve my mixes if I go over it slowly and just kind of iterate on the process a couple of times. I don't try to get lost into this, so I'll probably never end up doing more than like 3-4 sessions of it, and then really I need to start working towards a finished mix. What that entails for me is that there's like a final checklist of things that I go through, just checking everything and kind of like ticking boxes just as like a quality control. And once that checklist is finished, I'll just say like, okay, this is it. I'm not going to be making any more changes to it. I just need to push it out. At the end of the day, as an artist, you just have to say at some point like, okay, we're finished. We can move on and we can start working on something new. Now, before we continue, I do quickly want to say that if you enjoyed this video at any point, please make sure to leave a like. And if you're new here, make sure that you subscribe. You can also support the channel financially by checking out my products on Gumroad or checking out my Patreon page, where you'll find early access to videos as well as priority in feedback streams. Link for both of those are going to be in the description. Now let's get back into the video. So when it comes to the workflow itself, when I first start the project, the way that it actually works is that I import all of the files, I organize them the way that I want them to, also with like a priority. I want my kick to be the highest track in the drum sections. When it comes to the bass line, my main bass line has to be on top, and then any other bass line that I might use here, we have like an intro Reese bass. Sometimes the same stuff is true for sequences, where I'll already decide a little bit of a priority for some of the sequences. Or I'll organize for some of the one-shots like we see here and organize them with a little bit of like a priority system to it. In this case, I didn't really do that because I wanted to get this mix over a little bit quicker. To be honest, this project was falling a little bit behind, so I just wanted to get it over with, and I just started the mixing process as soon as possible. But you can see that the priority still holds in terms of the drum loops, where the most important drums are like at the top, and then less important parts, which are not part of the main drum loop, are down below here. And obviously the project as a whole is organized into the main groups that kind of distinguish effects from vocals, from pads, from one-shots, from sequences, bass lines, and then drums. Now, as I said before, these files come in normalized, but if you just have all of the normalized file playing, then obviously it's going to be way too loud. So as I said, the first thing that I do is I take off 8 dB of volume. And then what I'll do is I'll mute all of the tracks that have audio on them, like this. None of the groups are going to be muted, but this way I can just add one by one each sound and I can mix it in as I go. I'll usually set volume, do some minor EQing, maybe add 1 or 2 effects that I immediately spring up in my mind, but the main goal is to just quickly add all of the sounds as quick as I can. Once all of the sounds have been added in this way and they've all been kind of given their main volume balance, only then am I going to go through and start analyzing a lot of the sounds, start adding even more effects where I think I need to. And once I'm happy with the overall tone of all of the sounds and I'm happy with the balances that I've established between the sounds, I'll go and prepare the final mix. When it comes to the final mix check, what I'm mainly focusing on is the cleanliness. I've talked about kick and bass cleanliness a lot on my channel, and that's for a good reason. I do like it when the kick and bass is nice and clean. What that doesn't mean is that there cannot be any saturation in there or something like that. It mainly means that I'm looking at the waveform and I'm looking at the transients of the waveform. So right here we have the example kick and bass. And if we were to turn on this equalizer, which I've prepared with a very steep high pass, we'll see a big phase shift introduced into the kick and bass. You mainly see it in the kick transient once it's playing. Note that the first kick transient is still clean, but then after the next kick transient, the bass line is starting to play into the kick and it starts to morph the kick transient around. We don't want to have those kind of things, so we'll remove any form of phase shift. What you will see in this case though, is that there's some remnants of some issues in the production, and I still should go into the production and try to see if I can remove this. You'll just notice that this transient looks different from this transient, and that should be addressed. There's some phase shift going on, kind of messing up this transient over here. So this is sometimes something that can happen. I have to go back into the production, make some adjustments. There's also another track in this project that has to have some adjustments. But both of these usually aren't that big of an issue that I immediately have to go into it. But both of those tracks still have to be replaced in the final mix. When it comes to overall plugin uses, yes, you'll see some plugins in here. If I scroll through this, you'll see quite a lot of effects on some of the sequences and stuff like that. You'll see significantly fewer effects on the one-shots, and then when we get to the atmospheres and mainly the effects, there's not much at all, because usually these are like background elements and there's not really much that you have to do other than just setting a volume balance. Now then we come to the vocals. Vocals tend to be more of an upfront element and therefore usually need a little bit more work done. You have to take care of some more of the details because they are going to be more noticeable in the final mix, in the final track. But the main point that I want to make is that most of the tracks have no plugins on them, and if they do, it's 1 or 2. There's going to be exceptions to that, of course. Here is a good example. Here you can see there's many plugins on this track here. My bass line is another example. There's a bunch of different LFO tool tricks that I'm doing here as well. So you can see many plugins on here, but that's not necessary for every single channel. In fact, it can be very counterproductive because you have to set up all of those plugins to make it sound good. And for every plugin that you bring in, there's a chance that you disrupt the balance so that you have to rebalance the mix, which obviously can massively slow down the process. So when it comes to using plugins, my main tip is really decide before you apply a plugin what it's supposed to do. That way, if you can already conclude that the plugin isn't really supposed to do anything or it is fairly meaningless what it's going to do, then you don't even have to add the plugin, because the fewer plugins that you add, the better it is in terms of a workflow perspective, because the faster you're going to get to a final mix. In that regard, if you have some setup like this here, I'm using this master desk here just for a little bit of analog saturation. There's a little bit of a box tone in this master desk, which I just like for some of my sequences. I didn't want to set up a master desk for each one of the sequences that I wanted to have this sound on in particular. So I just decided to run it in the sequences bus. So this is going to apply to all of the sequences independent of which one it is. They're all going to sum together, they're all going to combine together, and then the combined signal is going to be processed by the master desk here. Well, now you might say, well, there's going to be some sounds that you don't want to have this sound on, but really, that's kind of like the trade-off that you have. If you have it on each individual track, you'll have to go into each individual track and set it up for each sound so that it works properly for that sound. Or you can just slap on one of it, sacrifice a little bit of quality in some of the sounds that you maybe don't want the effect on. But it's just much easier in terms of a workflow. It's much faster. You're also saving some CPU cycles as a bonus. And really, I can do this because I don't really do this with stuff like EQ and that kind of thing. I'm just doing it with the subtle effects. In this case, I'm doing it for the box tone of this unit here. For those that don't know, the box tone is the straight out of the box sounds that you get by just loading up a plugin without even dialing in any settings of processing. This usually refers to the kind of saturation or nonlinearity that you hear in analog modeling plugins. Another example here again is this magma channel that I talked about before. This also provides a box tone. In this case, you can drive it a little bit if you want to as well. But this is just there to affect all of the different drums going through the drum bus. Speaking about drums, let's talk about my top loops, because mixing top loops are one of the hardest things to do in Psytrance. Speaking about drums, let's have a look at the top loop, because mixing drums is some of the hardest things to do for Psytrance. They have to be bright, they have to stand out, but they cannot take away too much attention from the sequences and all of the other things that are happening in the track. So the way that I like to achieve that is with a little bit of glue compression. In this case, I'm using the SSL compressor. I really like this compressor on this kind of gluing stuff. I then have a free plugin called Lufticus. I think I may have shown this off before on my channel. This is really nice for some high frequency air. As you can see, we're boosting around 40k, but that's kind of going to trickle down in the very highest frequencies that this drum occupies. And then the final trick, which I like to use to keep my drums under control peak-wise, is to push them into a clipper. And this is going to clip off the transients, not something that you necessarily hear, but that can really help prevent any issues later on when mastering, because the peaks aren't going to be spiking into that mastering compressor and the mastering limiter. Usually this last step of clipping tends to happen more towards the end of the mixing phase, which I'm now transitioning into slowly with this mix. I'll probably do one more session of actual mixing and then I'll start actually finalizing the mix, as I talked about before, where I just go through the checklist and check off all of the things that I need to do. Now you'll notice that there's another dynamics processor right after this clipping, and this is something that I've recently started to experiment with. I'm here sidechain compressing to the kick drum, and this is not something revolutionary. You've probably heard of sidechaining before. In fact, you've probably used sidechaining before, but usually what happens, people just kind of put it on there for like the pumping effect that it brings. Usually you'll find that people use something like LFO tool to really just pump the volume in over time, because they like the danceable effect that you get from that sound. Here in this case, it's not like that. This is supposed to be a kind of dynamics processing which you almost not hear. This is supposed to be the kind of sidechaining which you don't really hear. It's just meant there for separation and not for really aggressive pumping. And currently, as you can see, I'm using this from 4 tracks. So another example of where I'm sidechaining to the kick is this sequence here, and you can see use sidechain input is turned on, and we have a basic sidechaining setup here. In this case, I like to go with a low ratio and maybe a little bit of a lower threshold, as opposed to a very strong ratio. I also like a little bit of knee so that the sidechaining is kind of getting eased into. And then you can determine the exact pumping effect with the attack and release. I went for 0 milliseconds of attack. The reason for that is because I want to pump to the transient. In fact, you can see that we also have a minimum frequency for the sidechain input. I just want the sidechaining to act on the transient of the kick, so that it ducks it out of the way of the transient and nothing more. So just toggling between it on and off here, you can hear the difference. You can definitely hear that it adds a little bit of pumping, mainly because of the long release that I decided to add to this one. In case for the drums, for example, the release isn't that long. Now, something that I often hear during my feedback sessions is effect sounds which are too loud. When it comes to effects, for me, this whole group is a bunch of details, and all of it should be mixed probably very quietly, because nobody really wants to listen to just a bunch of different noises and stuff like that, different risers and downlifters. This isn't really music. What is musical about this is that they support the main idea, and therefore they have to be mixed accordingly. I hear so many times a mix where somebody has this beautiful building up kind of synth sound, and then it gets overtaken by a bunch of white noise that also seems to rise up to the exact same point. At that point, I would say that you should take the white noise and take the effect sound and put it behind the rest of the track, so that it supports the main melodic element or the main musical idea. Which pretty nicely lays into my next point, which is that you can redefine the production. If there's something that you're not entirely happy about in terms of the production, you can redefine it. That is at the end of the day what mixing is. If there's one main sound that sits in there and that you always said to yourself like this has to be in the track, it's so important for the track, but it just doesn't work for the track, then just scrap it. It's going to be really hard even in the mixing stage to just really properly put it in the mix if you don't believe in what the element is actually supposed to do. At the end of the day, it's a creative endeavor, and especially if you're working on your own music, it is still your music. So you still should have executive power over the production. And when it comes to clients' works, obviously you cannot do that. You cannot just scrap different elements and stuff like that. You have a client that is expecting a certain mix from you, especially in the revision stage where the client just straight up tells you, okay, I want you to change that, that, and that, and that. You just have to change those things. But when you're working on your own music and you're mixing for yourself, then it's really a good opportunity to just reevaluate all of the decisions that you made during production. Do these elements really have to be here? Is this track not too full? Is this track not too empty? Do I need to work on the production some more? As I said before, in this production, there's 2 tracks that I need to replace actually. Here is the other one. There's just an error in the production here where delay is turned off or on where it's not supposed to be. And I guess because of the new balance of the new mix, I never really noticed in the production, but now I notice it and I really want to change it. I'll go back in there, make that change, re-export, and then just re-import this into the mixing project. The cool thing is I can just go into the production project, make that one change, export this one file here, export it with the same name, and Reaper will automatically open up the new file. What definitely is a good idea to do when you're mixing though is to keep the production mix in mind. I always have it here on a muted track so that I can just listen to the difference. I can just hear how the musical idea is progressing and how the mix is progressing, if it's getting better or worse. It's just a nice reference point from, okay, this is what I started out with, this is what I wanted the production to be, and now this is what I want the mix to be. To that regard, you will also see that I often use a reference track. In this case, there's some track from Astrax loaded up, I believe Semantic Tales in this case. Also because that is a track that goes from slow to faster in the same way that the track that I'm currently mixing is doing. And using references is another great way to just kind of calibrate your ears. Obviously, when it comes to mixing, just like any other art form, it is a good idea to take influences from other people. Now, I don't suggest that you start replicating an entire track, but what you can do is use a reference to kind of get the tonal balance the same for your track, as well as the track that you like. And it just overall might also help you make the right balancing decisions by listening to how elements are used in the reference track as opposed to in your track. It is a good way of just figuring out if you're doing things in the right way or in the wrong way. Another good way to do that is by using analyzers. Now, I'm not against analyzers in any way. In fact, I encourage using analyzers, especially when you're beginning out. The reason for that is you have to kind of train your ears to hear a lot of the problems that you're trying to address in mixing. And in the beginning, you're not really going to know how to do that. So you might as well use some visual aids to just kind of show you what different things sound like, so that you can get familiar with the setup that you're in and the system that you're working with. You can use it to see what the solutions that you're using to some of the problems that you're trying to tackle actually implement in the actual signal. Using something like SizeScope, as you can see, you can monitor the waveform. This is another way that I, as I said before, just kind of check the production at the end. And really using analyzers to your advantage is just a real easy way to just get a little bit of a better sound, as it becomes easier to actually understand what the music is doing. Finally, I'll say that now after roughly a year of doing my mixes in this way where I actually export for the project, what I've noticed is that I've started to think a lot more about the mixing when it comes to the production stage. Like in the beginning, I was fixing a lot of different issues, and now I'm at the point where I just don't let it come to that point, where in the production already and in the sound design that I do and in the ideas that I have, it doesn't really come to the point where things start to clog up or there's too many elements in the same place, or the spectrum of some of the elements is just completely off and I have to really skew the spectrum in a different way. The longer I've been doing this, the more and more my finished productions actually sound like a mixed track. Obviously, that doesn't mean that I cannot still very much improve that mix. But in the beginning, when I first started doing these mixes in separate projects, it really felt like I was doing major tweaks and really redefining especially like the EQ of different sounds. Whereas nowadays, I have to make smaller and smaller changes to actually get sounds in balance. So that's going to be it. Those are going to be the 15 tips. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.